step, then another. I follow without thinking about where it ended. Not because it didn't matter, but because I was already inside it. Nothing inside that needed my attention. No unfinished task, no forgotten object. Still it felt familiar, like proof that I had been there before. I remembered how often I used to rush through rooms, treating them like transients instead of places. But this room didn't need to lead anywhere. It was enough that it existed. My hand but as completion.
But nothing about me was fading now. Each step carried its own way, its own completion. I didn't need to think about the next one. I realized how rare it used to feel to exist without chasing anything beyond the present second. Not because the future didn't matter, but because this moment was already
never really listened to. I stayed still after sitting, not reaching for anything. The chair held my weight without adjustment, without asking who I was today. Outside, the sky had the quiet afternoon color, not trying to impress anyone, just existing above everything. I remembered how often I used to move immediately, as if stillness would expose something I wasn't ready to face. But nothing was waiting to confront me. Now my hands rested on my legs, warm, certain. I realized how much of life had been spent anticipating change, preparing for moments that never announced themselves. But this moment didn't need preparation. It had already arrived. I took a breath without thinking and let it leave the same way. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, not because I wasn't sure, just aware of the exact point between inside and outside. The metal was cool, solid in a way that didn't need explanation. Behind me the room remained quiet, holding everything exactly where I left it. Nothing trying to follow me, nothing trying to keep me there. I could hear faint movement beyond the door, a distant engine, someone walking past without knowing I existed. For a moment I stayed in that space where nothing had begun yet. There was a time I would have rushed through it, afraid of hesitation, afraid of losing momentum. But hesitation wasn't weakness, it was awareness. I turned the handle slowly, felt the mechanism respond beneath my hand. The door opened without resistance, not welcoming, not rejecting.
drifting. Just allow it. I step forward. And let the moment close behind me.
Sat at the edge of the bed after turning off the light. The room didn't disappear. It just softened. Shapes remained where they were, familiar without needing definition. My hands rested loosely between my knees, not holding anything, not reaching. There was a faint glow coming from outside, streetlight passing through the curtain, just enough to remind me the world was still there. I listened to my breathing, not controlling it, not improving it, just letting it exist.
There was a time nights felt like something to overcome, something to survive until morning. But this night wasn't against me, it was simply present.
I realized how many moments had asked nothing from me, and how often I had answered anyway, trying to come, trying to resolve, trying to ride, but nothing here needed evolution. I stayed seated a little longer, not delaying sleep, just acknowledging that I was already here. I noticed the warmth of the mug long after the tea had stopped steaming. My fingers still wrapped around it, as if it could remember what it used to be. The room was quiet in the was asking me to move.
Lifted the mug slightly, felt its weight change in my hand. Still real, still present.
Outside, someone closed the window. That brief certain sound of something finding its final position. I sat there a moment longer, not waiting for anything to happen, just allowing what already existed to remain complete.
The kettle had already cooled, but I was still standing there, hand resting on the counter, listening to none in particular. Just the quiet that stayed behind after everything finished moving.
The window was slightly open, cold air slipping in without asking. I could see the street light reflecting on the floor, a shape that hadn't been there earlier. I remember when small changes like this felt invisible, like they didn't count unless they arrived loudly. But this one stayed long enough to be noticed. A car passed slowly outside, its tires dragging through wet pavement. That familiar sound of distance formed. I didn't follow it with thoughts, I stayed where I was. Sometimes nothing happens, and that's when you realize you're no longer waiting. There was a glass of water beside me, untouched, condensation forming around its edges, proof that time hadn't moved even when I hadn't. I placed my fingers against it, felt the cold surface, real in a way memory never is. I thought about the version of me that used to fill every silence, music playing constantly, noise laid on noise just to avoid hearing myself exist. But tonight I didn't reach for anything, I let the room remain honest.
The refrigerator turned on quietly, a low hum that asked for nothing and promised nothing. Still, it stayed.
trusting without correction. There was something unfamiliar in that acceptance. Not pride, not pride, not pride. I noticed the sound of the chair as I sat down. That soft shift beneath me would accept and wait without resistance. The room didn't react, nothing acknowledged my arrival. And somehow that felt right. The window was open just enough, cool air moving slowly across the floor, touching everything without choosing. I rested my hands together, not holding on, not letting go. There was a time I needed every moment to confirm something, that I was moving, that I was becoming. But now movement didn't need proof. Outside, someone started their car, the engine turning over once, then again, then settling into a steady rhythm. I listened without thinking about where they were going. Their direction had nothing to do with mine. I realized how much of life continues without announcement, how change never waits for permission. It happens while you're sitting, while you're breathing, while you're not trying to become anything else. The light in the room shifts. space exists in moments no one records. No audience, no memory trying to preserve it, just presence. I lifted my hand slowly, not to begin something new, just to continue existing. Paused in the middle of the room without knowing why. Nothing had interrupted me, nothing had called my attention. Still, I stopped. The earth felt steady around me, holding its place without effort. Somewhere outside, a door closed. The familiar final sound and distance again. I stood there long enough to feel my own balance. Both feet grounded, both hands at rest. There was a time I would have filled this space immediately, reached for something, created motion where none existed. But motion wasn't necessary now. But motion wasn't necessary now. From the window, touch the wall beside me. Not asking to be noticed, still impossible to ignore. I realized how much of life continues without urgency, how nothing forces itself to become complete. It simply arrives quietly without explanation. I took a breath and let it leave naturally. tension holding them in place. I realized how unfamiliar I used to feel, to exist without preparing for the next version of myself. Now there was nothing to prepare, only this quiet continuation. I stepped forward slowly, not because something was calling me, but because I was ready to follow myself. I stood near the door. 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 I stood near the door longer than necessary. I stood near the door. I stood near the door. I stood near the door. I stood near the I stood near the door. 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 I stood near the door longer than necessary.